So what's the output of this console.log 1 plus string 2 plus string 2? So the expression evaluated from left to right, and we have a plus operator, which basically we use to add number 1 to string 2, but in between we have a operand which is like unary plus operand. So that unary will convert this 2 to number 2. So the plus 1 will be converted as 1 and the plus string 2 will be number 2. So we are just adding first two numbers, 1 plus number 2 equal to 3, and then we are concatenating the last string part to 3. So the output will be 32. So the next one, console.log 1 plus string 2 plus string 2. Here we are just trying to concatenate string to a number. So the output will be 1, 2, 2. There is no unary operand in between. So we are just concatenated the string to a number. So the next one is console.log 1 plus minus string 1 plus string 2. So the minus sign here used to convert string 1 to a negative number, and then we add that negative number to number 1. Plus into minus becomes minus. So 1 minus 1 is equal to 0. We concatenate 2 to the 0. The output will be 0, 2. So the next one is, what's the output of console log plus string 1 plus string 1 plus string 2? So the first part, first plus is a unary plus operator, which basically converts plus 1 to 1 or plus string 1 to 1. So this part will become 1, and we are concatenating the rest of the part string to 1. So the output is 1, 1, 2. So what's the output of this console.log string a minus string b plus string 2? So in this the first two operands, string a and string b, are string as we see it. The negative operator is not valid for strings. So when we try to convert string a and string b to a number, they evaluate or convert it into NaN, not a number. The expression string a and string b results in NaN. The output of this will be NaN, and we concatenate the string 2 to the NaN. So the output is NaN2. The next one is, what's the output of the console.log the string a minus string b plus, here we have a number 2, not string 2. This is a number 2. So here the first expression, as I told, they converted to not a number, and the b also converted into not a number. So we have NaN, and we are trying to add number 2 to this not a number. So that basically results in not a number, the whole. So the output will be NaN. Anything we add to a NaN becomes NaN, not a number. Can you explain what AOT is? AOT stands for ahead of time compilation. It's a way of compiling Angular template and code at build time rather than at runtime. This results in faster startup times, smaller application bundles, and better performance. Describe how you would safeguard a component being activated through the router. You can use guard. Guard can check if the user is authenticated, are authorized to access the component and perform other checks before allowing access to the component. What are the types of guard available in Angular? There are 4 types of guards are available. Can activate. This allows or denies access to the route based on whether the user is authorized to access the component. Can activate child. It's similar to can activate, but it applies to the child routes. Can deactivate. This is used to prevent the user from leaving a route without unsaved changes. Can load. This prevents the loading of module until certain conditions are met. What are observables? Observables are a way to handle asynchronous data in Angular. They allow you to subscribe to a stream of data and receive updates when the data changes. They can also be transformed, combined, and filtered in a reactive way. Observables are key features in Angular and RxJS to handle asynchronous data stream, as I said. Also, they are similar to promises with additional powerful features like they have an ability to handle multiple values over time and support for canceling requests. Observable can be created from many sources like events, timers, and HTTP requests. Also, they are composable, meaning they can be transformed and combined to create a new stream of data. Overall, Observable provide a powerful and flexible way to manage asynchronous data in Angular application. How to inject base href? The base href can be injected in an Angular application using app-based href provider. So I've given an example how we inject. So first we import app-based href from @Angular common module, and then we provide the app-based href using the provide property of @ng module decorator in your root module. Once this is done, what we are doing here is we are using use value property to set my app, which means base href will be set to my app. So once this is set, you should be you can replace my app with your own base href value. Once this is done, and we have to provide a base href into your application using @inject decorator in component class. What is a parameterized pipe? A parameterized pipe is an Angular pipe that can accept one or more parameters. Pipes in Angular are used for transforming data before displaying it in the view. A parameterized pipe allows developers to pass arguments to a pipe to modify its behavior. The parameterized or the parameters can be specified in the template and passed to the pipe using the pipe operator. What is a module and what does it contain? In Angular, a module is a container that helps organize and group related components, directive, pipes, and services. It is used to define a context or a scope for these building blocks of an application, allowing them to be used in other parts of the application. Modules can also contain providers that allow these components, directives, pipes, and services to be shared and reused throughout the application. Modules in Angular are defined using the @ng model decorator. What is router state? In Angular, router state refers to current state of a router, which includes the current URL, the current router parameters, data, and any other information associated with the current route. The router state can be accessed using router services, and it can be used to retrieve information about the current route, navigate to a new route, or perform other actions related to routing in an Angular application. The router state is an important concept in Angular. It allows developers to build dynamic and responsive web applications that can navigate between different views and pages based on the user interactions. What is the use of CodeLyzer? CodeLyzer is a static code analysis tool for Angular projects. It is a set of TSLint rules that can be used to check the code quality and adherence to the best practices. It can help identify potential bugs, security vulnerabilities, and other issues in the code base. CodeLyzer can also help maintain consistency in the code base and improve the overall maintenance of a project. Explain the purpose of bootstrapping module. In an Angular application, the bootstrapping module is the entry point that launches the application by initializing the root component. The main purpose of the bootstrapping module is to tell Angular which module to load when the application starts and which component to bootstrap. In addition to initializing the root component, the bootstrapping module is also responsible for configuring various aspects of the application, such as setting up dependency injections, loading third-party modules, and also providing any required configuration settings. Do I always need a routing module? No, you don't always need a routing module in Angular application. Basically, a routing module is used to define the routes in an application and map them to the corresponding component. If you have a small application with one or a few components, you may not need a routing module. However, if you have a large application with multiple components and pages, using a route module can help you organize your code and makes it easier to maintain. Also, if you plan to use lazy loading to improve the performance of your application, you will need to use a routing module to define the routes for your lazy loaded modules. What is the difference between ng-oninit and constructor? ng-oninit lifecycle hook is a method is typically used to initialize state after the component has been rendered. The constructor is used to initialize class-level properties and inject dependencies. ng-oninit has access to the component's input and DOM. The constructor does not have access to inputs and DOM element. ng-oninit method is called after the first ng-on change hook. Constructor is called before ng-on changes hook. It's possible to use constructor to fetch the data from an API, and it's generally not recommended. This can block the UI, and it's not the constructor primary responsibility as well. In simple terms, the constructor is like the blueprint or the plan of your building, while ng-oninit is like the move-in day. The constructor is called when the component is created, and it's where you can define and initialize the properties of the component. But ng-oninit is called after the component is created, and it's where you can do things like fetch data from a server or initialize any other external resources. think of it like this. So when you are building a house, you start with a plan, and that plan is like a constructor. It defines how the house will be built and what it will look like. But once the house is built, you need to move in and start living in it. And that's like NG on in it. You might want to set up the furniture, hang some pictures, and make the house feel like a home. Similarly, NG on in it lets you do the setup and initialization for your component after it's been constructed. What is the difference between add component and add directive in Angular? Both add component and add directives are decorators used to define classes that can be used in templates. There are fundamental differences, as you can see in the table, and add component is used to define component that has a template. The component is a fundamental building block of an Angular application, and it is composed of three parts: the template, the controller, which is a class, and the style. A component is intended to be used as a standalone element that can be reused throughout the application. On the other hand, add directive is used to define a reusable behavior that can be applied to elements in the DOM. Directives do not have a template of their own, but rather modify the behavior of existing DOM elements. Directive can be used to add behavior to existing elements or to create new elements with a custom behavior. The main difference is that add component is a type of directive that has a template, while add directive does not have a template, but instead adds behavior to existing DOM elements. To see all this behavior, you can go through it and understand more. Or let me read out. Add component used to create a new component by combining an HTML template and a TypeScript class. Directive is used to add a behavior to an existing element or a component. Add component has a template associated with it, which describes the view. Add directive does not have a template associated with it. Add component used to create standalone UI components such as button, forms, and other elements. Add directive is used to modify the behavior of an existing component, such as adding a new event or attribute. Add component can be bootstrapped to create a standalone application, but add directive cannot be bootstrapped, as they are designed to work in conjunction with the existing component. Add component can have their own style defined within the component metadata. Add directives can be styled using CSS, but the styles must be applied externally to the component using a decorate selector. Add component can use services and other components by injecting them into the constructor. Add directive can use services and other components by injecting them into the constructor or as an attribute in the add directive director. Decorator. Explain the types of data binding. There are three types of data binding in Angular: one-way data binding, two-way data binding, one-time data binding. The first one is one-way data binding. This is when the data flow in one direction, either from the component to view, like interpolation and property binding, or from the view to the component, that is event binding. This is like a one-way street where data is sent in one direction only. Two-way data binding. This is when the data flows in both directions, from the component to the view and from the view to the component. This allows you to bind a property to an input control and also update the component property when the input control changes. One-time data binding. This is when the data is bound only once from the component to the view, and any changes in the component property are not reflected in the view. This is useful when you don't need to update the view frequently and you want to optimize performance by avoiding unnecessary updates. Give an example of how one-time data binding works in Angular. As we know, one-time data binding in Angular is a type of data binding where the data flows from component to the view, but the view does not update the data in the component. One-time binding is achieved by using a square bracket syntax, as you see here. That is, a property is equal to value, where property is the name of the property in the component and the value is the value to be bound to it. For example, we have a component with the property name set to John Geo. We can bind it to a view using one-time data binding as follows here. The example. So in this example, the first line uses interpolation to display the value of name in the view. The other lines use one-time binding to set the text context, inner text and inner HTML of a p element to the value of name. Once the value is rendered, these elements will not update if the value of name changes in the component. This type of binding is useful when we have data that does not change often, or when we want to optimize performance by reducing the number of times the view is updated. What is interpolation? Interpolation is a type of data binding in Angular that allows you to display component property value in the view. It uses curly braces to enclose the property name or expression, which is then evaluated and displayed in the view. As I said, interpolation is one-way data binding, which means changes to the component property will not automatically update the view. Interpolation is useful for displaying simple text or values in the view, but it has its own limitation and may not be suitable for more complex scenarios. For example, let's say we have a component with a property called name, we see it here, that contains a string value. We can use interpolation to display the value of the name property in the HTML template like this. When the component is rendered, the value of the name property will display in the HTML template. If the value of the name property changes, the HTML template will automatically update the new value. For example, if the name property is set to Vilnaram in the component, the rendered HTML will look like this. Property binding. Property binding is a type of binding in Angular that allows you to set the value of an HTML element property to a component's property value. Lets you bind the value of component's property to an HTML element property. When the component property value changes, the corresponding HTML element's property value is updated automatically. For example, if you have a component property called image URL with a value of some image, so you can use this property binding to bind this value to an image element src property as follows. This will set the src property of an image element to the value of the image URL property of the component. The square bracket around the src attribute indicates that it is a property binding expression, and the image URL property of the component is enclosed in the brackets to indicate that it is a property binding target. When the image URL property of the component is updated, the src property of the image element is updated as well. What is event binding? It's a way to respond to user input, that is, data flows from the view to the component. It allows you to bind a component event, example button click, form submission, to a method in your component class. Sample code that shows how to use event binding to handle a button click is as follows. In this example, the button element has an event binding to the click event that calls the onButtonClick method in the component class when the button is clicked. When the button is clicked, the onButtonClick method logs a message to the console. This is the sample code for event binding. Two-way data binding. Two-way data binding is a feature allows the synchronization of data between the model and the view. Means when the data changes in the view, it will be automatically updated in the component, and when the data changes in the component, it will be automatically updated in the view. Two-way data binding works using ngModel directive. This is also called banana in the box, angle bracket and the bracket and ngModel. In this example, we have an input field that is bound to the name property using ngModel directive. This directive provides a two-way data binding between the input field and the name property. This means that when the user types something in the input field, the name property in the component will be updated automatically. Similarly, if the name property is updated in the component, the input field will also be updated to reflect the new value. Here the name syntax is used to interpolation to display the name property value in the view. The main advantage of two-way data binding is it simplifies the process of keeping the view and the model in sync and can help to reduce the amount of boilerplate code needed for handling user input and update the view. What is a component? A component is a building block of user interface. It is a small, self-contained piece of code that defines a part of UI, such as header, footer, or a complete section of a view. A component contains its own HTML, CSS, and business logic and can be reused throughout the application. Components are used to organize the user interface, make it modular and reusable, and to separate the business logic from the presentation logic. By breaking down the user interface into smaller reusable pieces, components make it easier to develop, test, and maintain large applications. Component has its own template which defines the UI or view of the component. The component also has its own logic, which is defined in the class that implements it. The logic and the templates work together to define the behavior and appearance of the component. For example, a login form could be implemented as a component. The component would contain the HTML for the form as well as the logic for handling user input and submitting the form. This makes it easier to reuse the login form in multiple places throughout the application and to modify its behavior and appearance independently of other part of the application. Components allow you to create more maintainable, scalable, and reusable code, making it easier to build complex applications with a consistent look and feel. Component versus directive. Both component and directives are used in Angular to create custom elements that can be used within a template. Add component is used to create a reusable piece of user interface, typically a more complex element like a form or a list. The component usually has a template associated with it that defines the structure and content of the view. A directive or an add directive decorator is used to create a custom behavior that can be applied to an existing element or a component. Directives are used to add or modify behavior of an existing element, such as adding validation rules to a form field or preventing a button from being clicked under certain conditions. While both are used to create reusable building blocks in Angular application, there are some differences in how they are used and what they can do. Here is a sample code I put up to show the difference between add component and add directive. In this example, we have both add component and add directive. The add directive is called highlight directive and is simply set the background color of an element to yellow. The component is called app component and it uses the highlight directive to highlight the text hello world. The difference between the two is that the directive is designed to be used as an attribute of an element. You can see it here. Whereas the component, add component, is designed to be used as a standalone element. In other words, the directive modifies the behavior of an existing element. This is an existing element and we are changing the behavior of it. While the add component is a complete element in itself. To use the highlight directive, we simply add highlight attribute to an existing element. This highlight directive, and we are adding this selector to an HTML element. This will cause highlight directive to modify the background color of the H1 element to yellow. On the other hand, to use app component, we should include it in our HTML like app root. This will create an instance of app component and renders it as a standalone element in the page. So while both add component and add directives are used to create reusable building blocks in Angular, add component is used to create standalone element, while add directive is used to modify the behavior of an existing element. How to use one component in another component in Angular? We can simply include the component selector as a tag in the template of the parent component. Let's say we have a parent.component.ts file which contains following code. In this code, we are importing child component and using it in the template of the parent component. This is a template and we are using it in the template component by including app_child tag. This is a child component .ts file and it's called child component class, and which has a selector of app child, and this displays heading tag. So when we run the parent component in our Angular application, we should see both parent component and child component displayed on the page or the view with their respective headings.